May 8, 1945. World War II is over.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
In London, crowds flood the streets. In Paris, strangers embrace and weep. In New York, Times Square erupts. 6 years of blood, fire, and horror, and finally, it was peace. But to some people, it was the start of a new nightmare.
You will not associate with German men, women, or children. Every German is a potential source of trouble. Therefore, there must be no fraternization with any of the German people.
While the victory parades were still moving through the streets of Europe's capitals, something else was beginning. 12 million people, men, women, children, grandmothers, orphans, were about to be torn from their homes, stripped of everything they owned, marked, humiliated, beaten, starved, and in hundreds of thousands of cases, killed. Not by the Nazis had lost, but by the victors. Who were these people, and why were they treated like that? To answer that question, we will have to go some years earlier. The Germans who were expelled after World War II were not, for the most part, Germans from Germany. They weren't soldiers who had invaded somewhere and then settled down. They were communities, ancient, rooted, deeply woven into the fabric of Central and Eastern Europe, who had been there for centuries before the word Germany even meant anything. Germany only unified as a nation-state in 1871, but German-speaking people had been living across Europe for over 1,000 years before that. In Bohemia, in the Sudetenland, there were German communities dating back to the 13th century. The Danube Swabians in Yugoslavia had been farming the same valleys since the 1700s. Germans in the Baltic cities had built those ports, those cathedrals, those trading routes, across generations stretching back to the medieval period. These weren't immigrants who had recently arrived, they were the people who had always been there. Each community had its own dialect, not quite like anything spoken in Berlin or Munich. They had their own folk songs, their own festivals, their own architectural traditions. If you walked into a Sudeten German village in 1938, you were walking into something that had evolved organically over 8 centuries of continuous habitation. Adolf Hitler used these communities. He pointed to them as justification for expanding Germany's borders. He claimed to be liberating them. But here is the crucial distinction that history has largely refused to make. These people were pawns in Hitler's game, not its architects. The Sudeten grandmother did not ask to be used as a pretext for the annexation of Czechoslovakia. The Yugoslav German farmer did not design the Holocaust. And yet, when Hitler fell, the punishment didn't fall on him, it fell on them. Collective guilt, one of the most dangerous ideas in human history, was applied to 12 million people who had no more control over the Third Reich than an ordinary American citizen had over the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. That is where this story begins. Before the first body was left on a roadside, there was paperwork, there was legislation. The persecution of Europe's Germans after 1945 followed a bureaucratic logic. In Czechoslovakia, the restored government stripped every ethnic German of citizenship unless they could individually prove participation in anti-fascist resistance. Almost none could. Overnight, 3 million people became stateless in the land their families had occupied for centuries. Then came the markers. Ethnic Germans were required to wear white armbands bearing the letter N for Nemek, the Czech word for German. They were banned from public parks, from restaurants, from sidewalks, from trains and trams. Their businesses were seized by the state, their bank accounts frozen. They were forbidden from gathering in groups, subject to curfew. Read that list again, slowly, stripped of citizenship, marked with identifying symbols, banned from public life, property confiscated, movement restricted. The victors, in their fury, had reached for the exact same bureaucratic toolkit the Nazis had used against the Jews. Then came the physical violence. In the summer of 1945, before the Potsdam Agreement had even formalized the deportations, what historians call the wild expulsions began. There was nothing orderly about them. Soldiers and civilians, partisans and lynch mobs, moved through German communities with rifles and clubs. Families were given minutes to leave. Those who moved too slowly were beaten. Those who resisted disappeared. Forced marches wound through the winter landscape. No food, no water, no shelter provided. People died on the roads and were left there. The elderly collapsed, children froze, and for those who didn't die on the march, there were the camps. Former Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz subcamps, Gestapo prisons, were reopened, scrubbed of their original victims, and refilled with German civilians. Women, children, the elderly, people who had never held a weapon in their lives. Let that sit with you for a moment. The same fences, the same watchtowers, different prisoners. In the final months of the war and the years that followed, an estimated 2 million German women were raped, the majority by soldiers of the Soviet Red Army. Historians have called it the largest mass rape in recorded history. Soviet war correspondent Natalia Gessi, who was there, wrote that soldiers showed no regard for age. 8 years old, 80 years old, it made no difference. Berlin's hospitals recorded over 100,000 cases in the city alone in the spring of 1945. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, historians estimate over 1.4 million women were assaulted. Many were attacked repeatedly. Many died from the violence or took their own lives afterward. And then, silence. The women who survived were expected to never speak of it, to rebuild, to move on. In East Germany, the subject was actively suppressed for decades to protect the political alliance with the Soviet Union. An entire generation of women carried this trauma in total isolation, told in effect that their suffering was an inconvenience to the official story. Then there were the massacres. In the town of Jatets, in June 1945, a group of German boys were caught stealing food. They were hungry. They were children. They were lined up against a barracks wall and shot. And that execution became a signal. Over the following 5 days, somewhere between 800 and 2,000 German civilians were killed. Their bodies were thrown into mass graves. In Postoloprty, that same month, hundreds more were massacred and buried in pits that weren't discovered for decades. In Yugoslavia, the remaining German population, 90% of them women, was herded into rural camp complexes. Historians who have studied the mortality rates use a specific phrase to describe these places. They call them extermination camps. Not metaphorically, technically, because in some of them, half the people who walked in never walked out. And finally, the wolf children, 45,000 German orphans, some as young as 5, fled into the forests of Lithuania after the Soviet conquest of East Prussia in 1945. They had no parents, no food, no shelter. They roamed the countryside, scavenging, stealing scraps to survive, chased away by locals, dying in the cold. Some were eventually taken in by Lithuanian families, but only if they abandoned their language, their names, their identity entirely. They were the most forgotten victims of all. Children, alone in the forest, with no one coming for them. So why don't you know this story? The silence wasn't accidental, it was structurally produced, layer by layer, by the very people who had the most to lose from the truth coming out. The expulsions were authorized at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 by Churchill, Truman, and Stalin. The 3 most powerful men on earth signed off on the removal of 12 million people. To acknowledge that this was a crime would be to indict the architects of the post-war world order, the same men who were simultaneously establishing the moral framework for the Nuremberg trials. The contradiction was too damaging to allow. So it was quietly set aside. Then the Cold War arrived and made everything worse. West Germany needed the protection of the United States, Britain, and France. It could not afford to antagonize its protectors by raising uncomfortable questions about what their soldiers and proxies had done to German civilians. And East Germany was a Soviet satellite. The USSR's role in the rapes, the deportations, the labor camps could never be discussed. Not once. Not publicly. There was also the problem of who spoke up. The survivors, the expellees, organized themselves into pressure groups, and some of those groups were infiltrated or led by people with connections to the far right. Neo-Nazis and revanchist nationalists grabbed onto this history and used it to push a narrative of German victimhood that was designed to undermine accountability for the Holocaust. That contamination made it politically radioactive for anyone decent to touch the subject. If you talked about German civilian suffering, you risked being weaponized by people whose goal was to erase Nazi guilt entirely. The result? An entire generation of survivors was told, explicitly or implicitly, that their grief was shameful, that they had no right to it, that acknowledging their suffering was somehow an insult to the people the Nazis had killed. And so they were silenced twice, once by the soldiers at their door, once by the historians who refused to write them down. Let's talk about the death toll. The most conservative academic estimate, based on post-war demographic records, puts the number of Germans who died as a direct result of the expulsions at around 500,000. The West German government and the Red Cross produced figures closer to 2 million. The gap between those numbers is enormous, and the reason for that gap is simple. No one wanted to count. No government had an interest in producing an accurate record of what had happened to these people. Now, was this genocide? Under the legal definition established by the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, genocide requires intent to destroy a group as such. The primary intent of the expulsions was removal, not extermination. On that strict legal reading, most of what happened qualifies as ethnic cleansing, rather than genocide. But then consider the Yugoslav camps, with 50% mortality rates. Consider the deliberate starvation at Świętochłowice. Consider a rape campaign so vast and so systematic that 2 million women were targeted over 8 months. Consider orphan children left to die in Lithuanian forests. At what point does the intent to make a people disappear become functionally indistinguishable from the intent to destroy them? If we applied the standards we use for other historical atrocities consistently and without exception, we would call this genocide. The fact that we haven't should make us ask a very serious question about whose suffering counts and who gets to decide.